Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Amanda Cameron and I'm a Quality and Food Safety Specialist here at Perennia. Thank you all for joining us to learn the importance of quality and food safety within food businesses. Today's guest speaker is Walter Demand, the owner of Demand Consulting. He was formerly the Global Nutrition and Scientific Regulatory Affairs Director at Mars Foods, and he recently retired after a 34-year career at Mars Food, where he held different roles in quality as well as research and development at a local and global level. He has a passion for applying science in business applications. For those of you who may not be familiar with Perennia, we are a provincial development agency with the mission to support the growth, transformation, and economic development in Nova Scotia's agriculture, seafood, and food and beverage sector. We have a diverse team with specialists in a variety of areas, including agriculture, quality and food safety, product development and commercialization, lab services, and fish and seafood. Our number one goal is to help food-related companies grow and take advantage of new opportunities. Next, we want to thank our funders. So this webinar is funded for Nova Scotia producers and packers through the Food and Beverage Business Accelerator Program. This program is a 2-year program ending this March, delivered by Perennia and Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture under the Federal Provincial Canadian Agricultural Partnership. Through this program, we have worked with companies to help them achieve their business goals for value-added products produced in Nova Scotia by the processing of raw Nova Scotia agriculture products. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Walter to start his presentation. There will be time for questions at the end, and you can place any questions you have in the Q&A box on your Zoom tab, and we'll answer those questions at the end.
Good morning. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Perfect. So thank you. Good morning to everyone. First of all, I want to thank the Perennia organization and in particular Amanda Cameron for inviting me to present a webinar on the importance of quality and food safety in food businesses. It's a real pleasure and an honor to me, and I hope that by sharing my experience, I can provide valuable input and stimulate further conversations on the importance of an integrated quality function and what this could mean for your individual food businesses. So very quickly, and Amanda actually already mentioned this, a little bit on myself, perhaps. So as Amanda was saying, I'm not a native English speaker. I'm a Belgian. Speaking Flemish is my mother tongue. I was trained as an agronomical engineer and got a PhD in food chemistry. And I recently retired from the food segment of Mars Incorporated after a career of about more than 34 years, which I held several positions within R&D, of which 10 years in quality. Currently, I'm still active as a consultant for the food industry, and I believe my experiences are still valuable to help businesses struggling with similar problems that I have been living through during my career. So let's move into the content of the webinar itself. Reflecting on my time in the quality function, I actually started as the person who had to manage quality issues. So that was the time that the quality function was managing issues in supply, incoming goods, manufacturing, operations, logistics, and also dealing with customer and consumer complaints. The work was pretty much ad hoc, and you could never set an agenda. It was always overruled by the events. So what I'll do is I'll use a couple of classical incidents and cases that I lived through as a quality manager, and I want to provide you with a few simple tools I learned in those days that I believe are still very valid to have at hand. Then around 1992, the business decided to implement ISO 9000 for the first time in answer to a lot of customer requests for certification. And by doing so, I realized that I had the privilege to actively live the transition from the quality manager as being the one who deals with quality incidents to the quality manager who actually engages the whole organization in the quality culture. And I think that's an interesting story to share. So that will lead also to a reflection on what are the skills and competences you expect from a quality manager. And I will also watch my clock and make sure it's time for the Q&A. So schematically, so basically what I wanted to show is basically thinking about this webinar, the crucial message and the takeaway message is basically quality function is an investment, it's not a cost. And the way I'm going to do this is basically first start with reflecting a little bit on what is a quality manager at a time doing in terms of handling incidents, what tools were useful. And I'll do that by using a couple of case studies. I have 3 examples which I want to allude to, and reflect on what are the tools and the learnings that really were very relevant in those cases. And then I go to the new phase where the quality manager becomes the person who engages the organization. Thanks to the integrated quality systems, you put quality in the center of the business strategy. And I will try to demonstrate that. And finally, we reflect on skills and competences for the quality manager. So that's a little bit of structure I had in mind of sharing with you today and going through this exercise step by step. So let's start with the first one. So the story I usually go back to is when I was a very young quality manager. I had a very dedicated quality technician, and one of his tasks was every day to go to the operations meeting. And during that meeting, it was every day at 9:15 a.m. All the issues from the last 24 hours were passing the review. Technical issues were passed on to maintenance to solve. Quality issues were passed on to the quality department. And so in the end, you end up with a bunch of stuff to solve, sort out, a messy organization, basically. And at some day he said, I'm so overwhelmed, I can't do everything because nothing seems to go right. And my answer was, you need to choose your battles. Not every quality non-conformity is worth a crisis. And let's go for tools to map that kind of classification or prioritization and check that with our stakeholders in the business. And that's basically what we did. So let me show you a few examples first of quality issues that could happen in our case, without going into the details, but something on the packaging can be wrong. Something in packaging, in the operation of packing, can go wrong. Something in the raw materials can be a defect, like contaminants, like something that is not functional, things like that. And I would very strongly recommend you to reflect in your business, what is the worst kind of incident that could happen? What are the kind of things that can happen to your business that put your business at risk, that will be causing rejects by the customer and by the consumers? Because that's going to give you a risk figure. Even if you put it in financial terms, this is what could happen in your business. And if you talk with your stakeholders within the business, senior management should know that this is something that could happen to us. You can look at the news, contamination, something, a defect that is really threatening food safety. That is something that can happen in food industry, and that is costing a lot of money. So it should be on the radar screen of the enterprise, looking in terms of risk and opportunities. So that's the first advice I have for you, is to think about what can happen to your specific food business. Let me go. Okay, and then the second question is, going back to this story of the operator, the technician that says, oh, there's so many things going wrong. How can you prioritize? Because not every quality non-conformity leads to a crisis. Now, let me go back into a first category of quality issues. The first category of quality is in the domain of what we can refer to as the non-negotiables, basically food safety and legality. In other words, every product that leaves a factory should not represent a food hazard to the consumer. You can really put people at risk. if we're not careful. So this is a non-negotiable kind of category. The same applies for the legality. So every product should meet legal requirements for the market of destination. And a great expression, easy to remember, was used by one of our former R&D leaders at Mars. And it was like, when it is not safe and not legal, it's probably not food. And I think that's the kind of expression that everybody should take on board. Because it's so easy to get alignment. So if this happens, then the whole business needs to get into action to prevent this from reaching the consumer. So your crisis management procedures need to be initiated, putting manufacturing on hold, retrieving products, communication programs, and things like that. And we come back on that later. A second tool that we used, and you can find a lot of references on that on the internet, is basically what they call the Kano model. On the horizontal axis, you will see the level of functionality, the performance of a certain attribute, the presence of an attribute of a feature. On the vertical axis, you'll see dissatisfaction up to satisfaction. And based on this kind of diagram, you can distinguish between at least 3 categories of attributes that are relevant for the consumer. The first one is on the bottom right-hand side. The must be attributes are considered as a given. They must be there. There is no negotiation possible. Fulfillment will not increase satisfaction, but the absence of it is a non-acceptable feature of the product. An example of that is food safety, for example. People expect the product to be safe. If it is not safe, it is not satisfactory. So absence of contaminants, the exact weight, you buy 50 grams, so it should contain at least 50 grams. So that's the first category. A second category is more linear. So the more, the better. Sometimes it's difficult to find an example, but in the case of food, I would say the perceived value of money. And the value of money is a measure for consumers that are a kind of a perception that, yes, I want more of this, so I'm going to give more money. So it can be more expensive if I see a value that is increased. For cars, it's easier. So the longer distance I travel with a gallon of fuel, the better. And then the third category is what we call the delighters. The consumer will say, I didn't realize I wanted it, but I really like it and want more of it. So these are the ones that, if it is not there, people don't even know that they want it. But if it is there and they get used to it, they really want more of it. Example there I usually give is the convenience feature. Things like health claims that resonate with my values and my expectations. Sustainability claims, the same. One thing I need to notice is that this classification is dynamic. What I mean is that, for example, an organic logo 10 years ago to 15 years ago, it was pretty unique. It was a feature that people say, wow, this is the delighter. I have this wonderful product and it is organic. Over time, it may become a must-be. So I expect fruit to be organic, not containing anything. Could be an example. So it is not static. It is really a dynamic model. And it is worth what it's worth. So people will have benefits and pros and cons for the Kano model. And you will find ways on internet that you can use consumer intelligence to classify your attributes of consumer attributes into this classification. Zooming in on this, it's what we call the S-curve. The S-curve is looking at when is a difference in an attribute performance becoming significant for the consumer. And this is a conversation or a tool that is often used in conversations around, can we reduce the cost of a recipe? Can we change a recipe, an attribute, and still keep the consumer's acceptance? It's only when you reach the point of significant difference that you need to be careful. So there is a space where you say it is indifferent for the consumer, so I can save on the cost. And so on the recipe cost, for example, I can reduce that to the point at which the consumer will notice a difference. One watch out in this approach is that if you do it in different cycles and say next year I want to reduce further my recipe, be careful, because then you tend to use the already cost-reduced version of your recipe, and you may gradually reduce your quality. And in the end, you may lose consumer appreciation. That's what we called the salami down approach in cost reduction. So watch out there. And the last word I wanted to bring on the table is a quick word about the business bias. What people mean with business bias is that there is often a tension between a quality mindset and the business viability. Let me give you an example. Suppose you have a new project that is requiring, from a quality mindset, an additional step to remove foreign bodies, for example. Well, this investment may turn the business proposal in a non-viable state, or less profitable, I should say. So there you will have a tension. This will be a tension to be resolved. And I think it will go back to the quality manager's skills and competences to argue and bring good arguments in order why this investment is justified, why we need to spend a little bit more money or delay. And the other aspect I wanted to mention in this slide is that once you have a business decision, everybody should feel okay with that. There can be a tension also with the personal ethics. What I personally also did is that when I can't tell it on the family table and share my decision, it's probably not the right thing to do. So sometimes you get these kind of conversations around, should we do this? Can we release that? Can we have a concession for this particular deviation of the quality spec? If you can't talk about this, then it's probably not the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So these are things to keep in mind when you talk about quality mindset. An easy grid that is often used is the ABC grading of product. So A is very clearly within specification, no problem, everything is fine, green, you want most of that. On the other side, C grade is where you're not meeting a food safety standard, where you're not meeting a legal standard, or where you're not meeting a critical consumer attribute. So this is really a case where you need to stop the line. You need to fix the line before you start up again. You need to retrieve products, make sure that everything's being held and corrected before it reaches the marketplace. And then you have this category in between, the B grade product, which is not perfect because some non-critical attributes may not be exactly on target. This is where you get conversation around, well, we have a little defect during packing on the line. There is something touching the packaging, the cartons, and every time we have a little bit on the carton, it's not perfect. But then you need the kind of business context and say how much pallets have been produced, what is the cost of repacking, unpacking, repacking. These are the kind of arguments that place ad hoc, basically, and will justify or not justify a corrective action or not. So most of the conversations that a quality manager needs to do is in this B grade category. The C grade, that's where we have the safe and the food safety and the legal issues or a critical consumer attribute. So nobody will dispute that there is a real problem to hold. The most of the discussion sits in the middle. And so the B grade product, continue the production, but correct. That's important and in time, I would say. Now, let's move to part two. And look at a few examples where I can remember using tools that might be helpful for you to be aware of. The first example I wanted to raise here is the famous Belgian PCB and dioxin incident. So what happened here, let me just take my notes so I'm not forgetting anything. What happened is that there was a small amount of dioxin, actually a few grams, contaminating the feed of chickens. And it was found out by the fact that some poultry was dying simply because of this contamination. Several farms who had the same product took feed from the same supplier. And the actual amounts were perhaps very, very small, but the supply chain affected was enormous. The delays in making this problem public resulted in a transnational spread of the issue and major political crisis in Belgium with the fall of the government and a new election. On top of that, we had a European situation that product was moving across the borders. And so we didn't have at the time the proper communication tools between member states. So the positive thing on this side is that great lessons have been taken at the European level to regulate that a member state needs to report a quality incident like this to other member states in the famous rapid alert system for food and feed. A second event that followed this incident was the creation of the European Food Safety Institute in Italy, basically. So what were my lessons or my take-outs is basically that as soon as we had the debrief from the Belgian authorities to the industry, it was very clear that this was a serious thing. It was not safe and legal. So there was a really, real issue. And so it means action, immediately action. And so I remember it was a Friday afternoon, and even the day itself, we had a crisis meeting with our R&D director. Over the weekend, we did a product screening in our recipes system in order to know what products could be affected or not. And again, support from the senior management to really put product on hold, to really stop the line that could be affected, and then reaching out to the authorities to find out how we can release, on what basis product would have been released for shipment to the market. And the two reasons were, or the two conditions were basically the traceability back to the farms. And the second was an analytical test that shows no presence above a certain threshold. And I can tell you that traceability at the time was really, really worrisome. So we couldn't go back to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. We really, really were at the beginning of that traceability requirements. And that's another change that was implemented afterwards. In terms of analytical testing, what you experience there is that first you need to find the capacity, and then you need capability. So the whole industry was asking for testing. And so the capability was not in place, or the capacity was not in place, sorry. So that was the first incident. And so just to repeat, and access to the facts, access to the data is extremely important, knowing what's really happening. The classification of not safe and legal. Communication is key. So both looking at what information is present in the outside world, what is the story exactly, what happened, what is going to be discarded. Chickens were destroyed, millions of chickens were destroyed. Senior management involvement from the beginning. The notion that food safety authorities are there to help. They really, really were very cooperative with the industry to say, this is exactly what you need if you want to export products from Belgium to the outside, to other member states. The creation of a crisis team is essential. So crisis team, and I'll come back on that in a minute, is very, very useful in time of crisis. A good recipe data system so that you can know what recipe is affected, what volume is affected, and where is it produced, and how is it shipped. Traceability, hold and release, that was a problem and has been improved since then. And then, of course, a good system that is very watertight for product retrieval and recall. So knowing where is the product, and then a system that says, now we're going to bring it back. Simple tool that is something I can recommend you very much is a simple communication template. You answer the question, what are the facts? What happened? What is the chronology? Well, who is involved? So that's the first question to answer. The second is, so what? So what are the implications for the business? What do we see as a consequence? How are we affected in this crisis? And then if so, What are the recommended actions? What are the actions that we see as necessary? This template is very easy. It's just a kind of a standard way of structuring a note to your stakeholders, but they're going to get used to it, because over time, when they receive a quality alert with this structure, they know they have to read it, because it might influence the business continuity. It's really an important message to share. And you can use this template again for upgrades and updates, and also for governance of the crisis later on. And that's the first thing. And then I mentioned the crisis teams, and usually you have two functions in the crisis team. The one is, what are the gaps in the information? So a gap can be, are we sure we are affected? Yes, this is the recipe portfolio that contains this ingredient that is currently in the news as a crisis. But are we really sure we are affected? So the data, the facts, do we have the analytical capability? Have we the test results? These are the technical kind of aspects of the crisis team. The second thing is, the second aspect or task of a crisis team is knowing what the facts are. How do we deal with the incidents? What are the customers that are affected? How do we bring back products? What is the communication? Communication is extremely important. It needs to be fast, efficient, very clear, very targeted to the audience. Sometimes you need to go to the press. So you really need expertise in communication to deal properly with the crisis of these sizes. And so this is important, crisis team. Sometimes you have one crisis team dealing all aspects of it. Sometimes you have a more technical part that is then feeding into the governance crisis team. Let's move to a second example, which is basically one that has been happening in US rice imports. I think it was I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the date. I think it was 2006. Yeah, indeed. So Liberty Link rice 601 was a genetically modified rice developed by Bayer Crop Science, and it was detected in very small amounts in batches of US rice supplied to Europe back in 2006. And it was a problem that was classified again as not safe and not legal. Not legal because it was a experimental strain that was not deregulated by APHIS. It was potentially a food safety issue because it's not being deregulated, so nobody could prove that it was safe to use. And then in Europe, you know, we have this precautionary principle that if you're not sure, you better not have it in your product. So the threshold was absolutely zero. And so small amounts were picked up in US rice, and it caused actually European Union, Japan, South Korea, and other overseas buyers to have an embargo on American rice imports. And it required expensive testing before they could accept shipments of US rice. It actually caused a collapse of the US rice export in that year and a sharp decline in the market price of US rice. So it was really a crisis in Europe, and many competitors have been pulling their products from the shelves because of the import in the US, from the US in Europe. So let me go to a few learnings again. Again, equality issues that falls into the non-safe and not legal. Traceability. Traceability was one of the major things that I was struggling with, because in a grain handling facility, you have silos, and what happens sometimes is that you're filling the silo whilst you're also using the silo. And that means rice from different batches can go together. And there was not a clear separation between that particular delivery or shipment from the next one. And so ideally, you want these silos to be empty at regular intervals in order to make your batch sizes much smaller than they were. So that was one of the lessons learned from that incident, I remember. Analytical testing, again, both a matter of complexity and a matter of capability and capacity. So complexity was because Bayer Crop Science was really worried that any contamination would fall into their accountability. And so they wanted and insisted to use the actual Liberty Link gene construct in all the analytical testing. But that was not available in time. So the crisis was there, and we wanted to make sure that we were not affected, or we wanted to know whether or not we were affected by this crisis. And so thanks to our contacts with scientific advisors who helped us understand how genetic modification is actually looking like from an analytical point of view, we could use generic tests to prove that we were not affected by any GM contamination. And then later on, you could say, suppose we have a positive, then we can look at the Liberty Link gene construct in particular. And then the second one is speed of operation. So speed of getting the information on your product was key. And it was really a matter of competitive edge to really find out whether our product was fine or not. And so we needed to build relationships with the analytical testing company. And in the end, we had even direct contact with the laboratory assistant looking at the machine results, and had immediately information on the time that we agreed to report on. So that was really, really important from a crisis management point of view as well. Yeah, this incident was really causing a lot of delays, in my view, in the acceptance and the introduction of GM in Europe, and also delayed the development of rice strains that were obtained by genetic modification, also in the US for rice in particular. So access to scientific advice was key. Access to the latest facts. Accessibility. I can't read my screen because pictures. Communication speed, senior management involvement, the food safety again were there to help. Again, we had a technical and a governance team, and the speed in getting analytical results was of competitive advantage for sure. Traceability again. Let's move to a last example of a quality incident, and I including the rice breakage as an example, not because it was a food safety or a legal issue. It was more an example where we struggled with root cause analysis. And let me explain a little bit why it was. So what I want to share here is that rice broken levels is a quality attribute in the final product of rice, because it relates to the stickiness of the cooked product. So if you have a high level of brokens, your product is inferior in quality. So therefore, every broken that is in excess of a specification needs to be taken out. And as a consequence, you are reducing the efficiency of your operation. So more brokens in your product before packing means that you have to take out more brokens, and your financial efficiency is reduced. And so therefore there is this kind of crisis when your broken, the rice broken is increasing during the milling operation. You will have this tension in the organization, because on the one hand side we want a quick fix, and on the other side we say we want to protect the quality. And so why is this broken level so variable? Looking at possible causes, we found that variation in environmental conditions during growing, during handling, but also moisture migration during processing and drying in particular, can lead to excessive broken sensitivity. And one of the takeouts of that crisis is basically that your data need to be within a certain context. We had a lot of measures in all places of the factory where we measured brokens, and it didn't allow us to find the root cause. It's only when we were working together with R&D and operations that we could find out that there was a link with the way the rice was being dried. After parboiling, rice is dried in a column dryer, or was dried in a column dryer with different phases of drying and tempering, drying, temper. And every shift has his own view on how to manage that dryer. And it caused actually tensions if you go too fast in drying, you create a tension within the rice grain that is making the rice more weak. So therefore it will break more easily when there is a mechanical force applied to it. And so what happened is that after setting the standard procedure in place and across all shifts, we could actually solve the problem. And so in the graphic I found there was the symptom was the broken, but the root cause was actually the way the operating procedure for drying that was unstable and not standardized, and causing tension in the grains and therefore broken sensitivity. So these are the kind of questions or cases that I wanted to bring forward in order to demonstrate a couple of tools. So I think I mentioned most of these. The measures were in place, but not necessarily linked to the root case. There was no quick fix possible. We needed a time to really go back to the science and to the fundamentals of rice drying. And in the end, you need procedures and you need training, and you need to be across the different shifts working along the same principles, basically. So I mentioned a couple of times root cause analysis. Let me show my notes here. So to investigating quality issues. And I want to give a few examples of things that can be helpful to build hypothesis. So in essence, root cause analysis is a brainstorming exercise that leads to a series of possible hypotheses, followed by a process of elimination based on information, facts that allow you to exclude some of these options. This process can be done by an individual, but it becomes richer when you have inputs from experts and non-experts. The latter because they ask sometimes the questions out of the box. If you are an expert in a field, you sometimes too deep in the topic and you don't see the overview, and the helicopter view is sometimes really essential. So some examples here. Everybody recognizes the fishbone diagram, Ishikawa, in Japan, and it can help already to indicate the accesses to cluster some of the possible causes in manpower, methods, material, environment, machine-related causes, etc. A second one is a classical mind mapping. It's easy. You can do it with pen and paper, and most of the tools I have here are just free to use, and you just use pen and paper, no cost at all. Mind mapping allows you to make links between different suggestions, to color, to report back, to rephrase a meeting, go back to a crisis meeting. What I also used all the time is process flows, asking exactly the question, where did this happen? What step in the process has shown you this data? Point to me what happens. Go in situ and look at the situation and try to make a view on what could have happened here. But I also used very frequently is a time log. So what are the events? What is the sequence of events that happened? And so this also could help identifying potential causes and relationships that you often would overlook without this. So it depends. I'm a very visual person, so I like graphics to think. And for those kind of people, it's certainly useful to have these kind of tools at hand. And then, of course, after this, what happens is that you start eliminating, say, it is not, we have evidence that it is not the case. But in the initial phase, everything is valid. Every suggestion of a root cause you put on paper. It's every suggestion is useful. Don't do it too quickly. Okay, so I think that's here. Data collection. A few notes and comments on data collection. Collection is key, but make sure you focus on the parameters that matter the most, that are actionable and are interpretable. It's so important. You can collect data forever, but if there is no action possible on the data, it's a waste of money and time. And so it's really, really important that you ask your question, when I ask for these data, what am I going to do with the results? Are they actionable or not? What data? And so what data, how to measure? So you all know that you can measure inline a temperature, a pressure, perhaps a product characteristic like a color or some near-infrared methodologies exist. That's the most easy and convenient way of having constant information about some of the characteristics, but it's not always possible. The next is online, where an operator takes a sample, makes an analysis, and take an action if necessary to adjust the process or not. And the last option is that a sample are taken on the line, from the line, and moved to a separate laboratory for example, a more sophisticated analytical determination, microbiology analysis, nutrition composition, packaging, material properties, etc., etc. So that's the offline situation, which takes more time. Then the question can be, who measures? Well, in the ideal situation of an integrated quality system, you think of a business as being a sequence of people doing little operations, and the output of one operational unit is the input of the next one. And so the most ideal situation from a quality mindset is that you measure your own work before you transfer it to your customer, even within a business. So why would this be the ideal situation? Is that it gives you ownership for quality. It leads to engagement, to proud, to self-respect, because in the opposite case, when a kind of a police force comes in and takes samples and say this was okay and it is not okay, it comes from outside. It is like you're going to lose more time before you have the results, and more time means there can be more product at risk that is not conform with the specification. And so the problem can become bigger if you lose time. So the closer you are to your operation, the better, I would say.
I'm just going to remind you about the time, okay?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Melda. I'll go a bit faster. Process control, it's not the point to go in detail, but this is where your data become meaningful. If you have the notion of process capability, then you can give the operator the permission to go faster, or to go in correction mode or not. Let me quickly go to the integrated quality management system. You find a lot of literature on that. The key benefits of that is for me that the quality culture is driven from the senior management to the top floor, to the floor. Delivery a product that meets customer and consumer expectation is linked to the strategic mission and vision of the business, and at the same time, rigorous data-driven decision-making process is deployed. I have a few stakeholders. I will leave it here, but you have a lot of stakeholders in this new approach, because everybody needs to be involved in the quality mindset. What I want to raise here your attention is this mechanism of plan, do, check, act. This is basically the engine of improvement, reducing the quality cost, improving your right first time. And this is a kind of an interesting image, because it shows you the time dimension in that. And then very quickly, quality by design. So I'm running now a little bit, but in the integrated quality function, you design your product with the mindset of the consumer's expectations and hidden needs. So this is exactly where you embed the quality in the design already. Maybe you spend a little bit of time on this slide very quickly. So for those who want to justify implementing quality systems in a business, the benefits of this is increased customer satisfaction, less inspection cost, better control, improved product quality and service quality, productivity, quality costs go down, simplified traceability, secure corporate knowledge because you write down corporate knowledge, increased legal certainty, support for strategy development, easier initiation of new associates, strengthened competitiveness, and less waste and rework. And I will add that also your engagement will be better. You will also have better clarity on who is responsible and accountable for what, and a better connection with your stakeholders and involvement of the senior leadership team. Final words on the quality manager function. Today, about 1 out of 3 is female, 2 out of 3 is a male. So there is still a gender gap, but it's closing. So this is good news, I think, for the function. In terms of, from what I mentioned, is that it's important for a quality manager to have a couple of skills, like able to do stakeholder management, understanding what your stakeholders have in mind, and also make sure that your agenda is known by them. Standing alone, decision quality, very logic and pragmatic, but also with limited data already take a very sensible recommendation. Communication, motivating others, problem solving and drive for results. In terms of functional competences, of course, you need food technology background, the basics of food microbiology, food safety, toxicology, food regulation is a plus, packaging regulation potentially, and then integrated quality management system. Some of these things can be learned on the go, so no worries there. And perhaps a final word on organizational design. I've seen situations where the quality manager was reporting into R&D. I've seen situations where the quality manager is reporting into supply and operations and the plant manager. Both can work. There is one condition in my view, is that the quality function should also have a kind of a certain degree of independency and say, here is a red line. Really, really important if you think of this safe and legal category of incidents, the quality manager needs to have a say to say, here is the red line. Yeah? Very important to remember. So takeaway messages, quality science is not rocket science. You can have free, simple tools, freely available, easy to implement, and come at no cost. Quality function is not a cost, but an investment. Mindset should be on anticipating problems rather than fixing problems. Worst possible quality incidents that could happen is something to brief your senior management for. So they should be aware that this is the worst thing that could happen to us, and therefore we need to anticipate and mitigate that risk. And finally, quality is a great function to learn new skills and to develop great talent for the future. I will stop here. Listen to your question.
Great, that was amazing. A lot of little tools for us to use day to day. All right, so we did have some questions sent in from before the talk, so I don't see any in the question box. So I will. Okay, so the first one was, given your experience, how have you and your team successfully measured management commitment to satisfy audit requirements in the past?
So thank you for the question. So really good question. And what I think is that in audits, we will question the senior management and make sure that we understand that the senior manager is also understanding the quality culture, but also drives resources, make sure that he put resources available in places that were identified as a risk area. We also will look at, is there a governance meeting, quality what do you call this? Um,
KPIs.
KPIs, or the KPIs being tracked in as part of a strategy. uh, Quality should function there, because, as I mentioned, quality is actually answering the consumer needs. So meeting that consumer need will lead to less consumer complaints, less customer complaints, better service levels. So in my view, these are the kind of things you will look for in an audit. So are they mentally aware of how important the quality function is? What would happen if there is no quality function? In my view, you will run into much bigger costs and much bigger issues if you have quality problems on a regular basis. You can put people at risk. Bad reputation is costing an enormous amount of money. And it's easy to restore. It's not easy to restore. So once you got in the news with bad management of a quality crisis, you got into news with a crisis. It's not a problem. If you manage it properly and you communicate in a good way, people will say, well, I trust this company because if there is an issue, they're going to handle and take the right measures. If you come in the news and say, oh, it's not so bad, and then next week you go back and say, well, we thought it's bigger. The problem is bigger than we expected. That is not the right way to go for communication, and you end up with a very poor image. Is this okay?
So the next question, this one's more from me. I worked previously with wheat. So when you were talking about the silos being hard to trace, so I guess more of a traceability question is, and recall would be, how can you recommend that food businesses be more prepared for traceability and recalls?
Yeah. So I think in Europe and in particular in Belgium, we have 4 hours to go with a report to the authorities that our product, the product that you have in hand, here was the supplier of the ingredients. 4 hours, we need to be able to say that. And then if you go back to that supplier, this person also has 4 hours to illustrate and to document where the product comes from. So that's the kind of level we are up to now here in Europe. It's so important. And going back to the grain handling, the frustration was that for this whole year, I could only have 4 batches of rice. And so there was no way to separate that. So we needed to take samples back in history in order to make sure that there was not any relation with the contamination. But that was a very frustrating observation, that we didn't have silos coming empty, and therefore we couldn't split between different batches. So my recommendation is always, if you have this kind of system, make sure your silo is sometimes empty, and you start from a new batch from there.
We ran into those issues too. It would be like one year, we would almost use the same wheat across the full year, and then we're like, whatever, that's too hard to trace. So no, it's good to make those observations and the gaps that you have in your systems.
Exactly.
So what would you say is the greatest challenge for a food safety and quality professional?
The greatest challenge for today, I think, is to keep aware of what are the new bugs, what are the new threats in food safety, what are the new findings in science that allude to a potential problem. And whilst I'm saying this, I'm thinking of climate change. We know that climate change is going to lead to different organisms to spread out in different crops, in a different way, in different geographies. So that's one. But at the same time, you're facing the problem, how much information can you process in your organization? Because not everything is a real threat today. And you can help your management for sure in filtering and say, these are the 3 ones to keep an eye on. And keep them aware of the evolution. So I would say mycotoxins, be careful there. There is a trend. Warming climate is leading to different strains, to different geographies that are affected. And so this could be a very important one to monitor. And then with more specific and more accurate analytical systems, you find more lower doses of certain contaminants. And in people's minds, 0 is 0, but in the practical sense, you're talking about analytical certainty. And so therefore, these certainties is becoming, the threshold for detection is lower and lower. And so therefore, that's the other threat that I see happening, that people are expecting 0. But in actually, if you start analyzing some of the raw materials, you may find very, very, very low levels with the new techniques. And so that's another kind of complexity for the food industry to phase into, I think. And so being connected as a food industry with research institutes and trade organizations to tackle that as a whole industry, I think is the only way to deal with that. You can't do this as an individual company. It's too complex, and you cannot coordinate the connections with the research bodies to help you, and authorities can help you as well in my view, to guide you through that.
Great answer. So given the labor shortage, and often in Atlantic provinces, a lot of our companies that we work with are very remote. So would you say that hiring from within and training internal staff to do a QA role is feasible and realistic?
Yeah, I'm a very, very strong believer of developing people who have this kind of devotion for quality. You can find it in every function almost. And at Mars, we had this kind of belief that you can learn on the go a lot. And as I said, quality is not rocket science. It is logical thinking. It's really making trade-offs and thinking about risks and using information in a clever way. I always said to the guys in the operations, I don't know your machine, but please explain me what happens here and what happens there. And the operational line is usually the best place to explain me what the machine actually does. And so as a quality person, you can take that information and turn it into a logical scheme, a visual, a tool to work in. You don't need to know everything yourself. Having a network, having connections within the business, outside the business, with your former university or whatever. So there is also so much you can do. So I'm a strong believer in internal talent. And that was, I think, my final takeaway message. So I'm so grateful for that time I was in quality, because I learned skills in that time in terms of organization, motivating others, trouble analysis or root analysis that I used in my later career after that quality time. So you have the chance to deal with different levels in the organization. You talk to senior management, you have to delegate, you have to lead a team. So these are the skills that you can learn in this role. And so my answer is yes. It is a great idea to use people from supply, people from commercial even in that role.
Great, thank you so much. I think that was the last question I had for you today. I want to thank you so much for doing this webinar with us. I'm sure everyone learned a lot. And I'm also going to just quickly bring up, we have, sorry. I just want to bring up the training that we have for food safety with Perennia. So we have a developing and implementing preventative controls, prerequisite program, developing a HACCP plan, preventative control plan, and we also have a course about root cause analysis. So if any of these trainings interest you, you can check them out on our website at perennia.ca/learning, and all the dates and times will be listed on there. So I just wanted to add that in at the end. And thank you so much, Walter.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure